Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to the premiere of Purple Table Talks, a series that is brought to you by the TCU Alumni Association. Last year, during our conversations with you as our alumni, we heard you. We wanted to ensure that we continued the critical conversations that you brought to our attention. And so therefore, we present to you the Purple Table Talks, a quarterly series where we will tackle topics that you bring to us that you see as important. And I'm so excited about the topic that we get to address today, as I am joined by our guests, Dr. Eric Wood and Chatashia Brown, and I will provide their biographical information in just a few moments. I wanted to set the stage for us today, though. As we are continuing to have the critical conversations and really create some actionable steps towards a more inclusive environment, not only within the Alumni Association, but TCU as well. I wanted to point out something that our TCU faculty and staff are currently being trained on, and that is the training that they have on being able to have culturally informed trauma responses for our students as well as each other. And while they were receiving this training, I am very excited that we get to bring this topic to our greater alumni family. This is in alignment with our newly formed DEI committee that we have through the Alumni Association as we continue to spread awareness, provide education, and take action on those topics that are very critical. So I'd like to introduce our guests for today. We have first Secondhand Brown, who is a second-year master's student in higher education leadership at TCU. She serves as the graduate assistant for multicultural and international student services, as well as the graduate intern for TCU's Counseling and Mental Health Center. Her work aims to ensure schools are supportive and culturally relevant learning environments for marginalized students. Her research interests include equity and inclusion practices within higher education, culturally based trauma, and Black and first-generation college student experiences. Additionally, we have Dr. Eric Wood, who currently serves as the Director of Counseling and Mental Health at Texas Christian University. He has over 12 years of experience in college mental health, including serving on the governance board of the National College Depression Partnership and a peer reviewer for the Journal of American College Health. He's a frequent presenter at national conferences, provides consultations with various colleges and universities, and is a former diversity scholar of the Association of University and College Counseling Center Directors. He has successfully authored 2 federal grants with the Department of Health and Human Services to provide over $500,000 in external funding for suicide prevention and clinical services at TCU. Dr. Wood has been mentioned in publications such as the Texas Tribune, U.S. News and World Report, the Chronicle of Higher Education, and the New York Times. Thank you both so much for joining us today as we tackle this topic of culturally based trauma and what culturally informed trauma responses truly are. So I'd like to start with just setting the stage for what's happening at TCU right now. If you could just give us a brief overview of what TCU is doing right now to address students' mental health needs, given the social justice, injustice, and racial injustice that's really been brought to the forefront over the last year and a half. It feels like things have really kind of exploded in this area. So what has been the response of the university at this point?
Yeah, I can start, and Shatej, if you want to jump in from the student level too. Obviously mental health has been a big initiative on our campus, giving everything that's gone on in 2020. And our really framework is to the administration is like, how do you make sense of all the different dynamics on our campus? And so we talked about it with a trauma-informed approach. And the idea of being that most of the global community is experiencing some type of emotional trauma. But then if you look at, like you said, there's the spotlight on racial tensions, there is a cultural-based trauma too. And so having using that framework and saying this is probably the best way to articulate what we're seeing on our campus. We have students, or not just students, but faculty and staff too, and alumni that are actually having these trauma reactions based on what's going on in the world. And the idea that that is what's happening, then we expect a lot of struggles, but also certain reactions on our campus. So that was kind of the precedence for these trainings. And as you said, we got support from administration. We developed this training. It wasn't just me, it was a collaboration of different offices. And the first part was an awareness training. We trained over 600 members of our TC community. Most of them have been faculty and staff at this point. And we're working on another one to do an experiential where they can actually practice. So in terms of actually getting the word out in the community, that's been the major initiative so far. And Chatashia is actually on our advisory board because we have students chiming in, so she wants to talk about that.
Yeah, so we've been meeting with students periodically to kind of get an idea of answering the question, what does a trauma-informed campus look like? And so meeting with them and kind of just talking through some ideas of what they would like to see at TCU to kind of improve their experiences here and kind of relieve some of that trauma and help them overcome it and basically create a safer campus for them.
Thank you so much for bringing that up, because it's not just about starting at the starting point that's already been identified, but also ensuring that the campus remains responsive to what the student needs are. And so I know we'll be able to talk a little bit more about what that response looks like and what that and the other actions that are being taken. But something that you said, Dr. Wood, in terms of really starting the training at the awareness level so people can just fully understand what cultural trauma looks like. So can you all just walk us through, what does that awareness training look like? What are some of the things that you're covering so that people are aware of what culturally based trauma is?
Yeah, it starts off with just, really making the argument just how prevalent kind of emotional trauma is in the last, year. So we start off with the definition of trauma, and the definition really says if you really go through an individual experience, a physical, emotional, traumatic, a potential harmful event, if it lasts longer than 4 weeks and impairs your functioning, that is the definition of trauma. So we make the case that given that definition, pretty much the whole global community has some type of emotional trauma within the last 12 months. And most people get that. They understand it's like, yeah, this was a really hard year. This is very challenging. And then we, break it down and say, because think about it in a cultural base realm. If you have a community, a collective, and a collective for us means an inherent, something like, we're African American. I cannot be not African American. Even if I disavow my race, the world is going to look at me as African American. So if you have an innate collective and they all experience an event, like the George Floyd video, and they all say that event left a mark on us, and it changes that collective in irreversible ways. That is a definition of culture-based trauma. And we're really using that because there's so many talk about, let's go back to normal, let's go back to normal. But we're assuming that there's certain parts of the students that are the same. Because of what's going on in 2020, those certain parts of the students may never be the same. And we need to take that in consideration. So we really make the case of okay, culture-based trauma is also very prevalent, giving everything that's going on at campus, and we need to pay attention to that. And so it's just the idea of the awareness. We want people to leave with those concepts in their mind that trauma is really prevalent, and even for the faculty and staff that they themselves has gone through trauma, but also the culture-based trauma is just as real and just as powerful.
Thank you so much for that. So just to recap, knowing that when we're a part of that innate collective, that we can experience trauma within that innate collective, when with the experiences that we all had globally last year, especially given what we saw not only with George Floyd, but additionally before the death of George Floyd, we had a series of murders that took place. And so there was never a time for us to recover from any of those murders that we saw play out so publicly. So that leads me to the next question that I have in terms of awareness is important, but a lot of our alumni are asking, okay, what do we do after awareness? So what are the actions that we can take? And so my first question for the two of you is, what can we do? What can alumni do, or anyone who's watching this, what can they do to ensure that they don't dismiss the experiences of those who are experiencing culturally based trauma?
Yeah, I mean, I could take that. Strategic take that because we're hearing a lot of concerns about from students, getting reactions from faculty and staff. And so I'll let Shateja talk about that. But for me, I'll say the first part. I mean, the awareness part is very key because one, it helps articulate what's going on to really frame it in the words that this is a traumatic experience, because we're seeing a lot, like we did this with athletics, stereotypical, I'm not weak or anything. But when you think about it as a trauma, it's not a matter of being strong or weak or anything like that. Anyone can experience trauma, and the trauma can be debilitated and can break it down. So when you start realizing, why am I having these panic, or why am I on edge, or why am I ruminating, but can't get this out of my mind, if you really articulate, it's not about being weak, it's about you experience some trauma. Hopefully that will motivate you, first of all, just to get help. So no one who recognizes trauma, hopefully will just sit there. They have this need to get help. But also when you're dealing with other people and you see them, you may be kind of struggling and, ruminating and having the ideal, okay, that person might be going through trauma. Maybe that might put a different perspective about, okay, I need to be more open to their experiences. I need to be more supportive, because if you don't have that trauma, you could say something that could cause a lot of harm. But if you're trauma aware, you're less likely to say something with that. So
Thank you.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think that's why the awareness piece is so important, so that you can recognize those trauma responses in people. And I think being more aware will kind of decrease your willingness to dismiss things like that. So a lot of times students get dismissed when they're showing trauma responses because, faculty might assume we're all going through something, you know what I'm saying? So they might not understand what it's like to be, per se, like for me, a Black student also in a global pandemic. And so it might be this, but once you become aware of what a trauma response looks like, then you can, okay, I see this student is moving against, or I see this student is moving away. What can I do as a faculty member or as a staff member to kind of bring them back and get them the resources that they need to be able to.
Thank you so much for that. And as we continue this conversation, I want to encourage any of our viewers to make sure that you put your questions in the chat. We want to make sure that we are having a conversation, not just amongst the three of us, but amongst the whole community. This is some amazing information that both Dr. Wood and Chatashia are sharing with us. You all both mentioned being aware of what trauma response looks like in students as well as our peers and those within our community. What are some specific signs of trauma response that people can make sure that they're aware of, so that they know exactly what they're seeing in someone else?
Yeah, the best way we do this in our training is, if you think about like physical trauma, and most people have heard about the fight, fight, or freeze response. I mean, that is something that, the metaphor is like, if you see a threatening situation, someone jumps out of the bushes right in front of you, your body automatically changes. It's either to fight it or to run away from it. It doesn't really matter. Your body just automatically changes. The ideal is that your body's telling you do something. And so if you don't do something and you just stay in that threatening situation, then your body's operating in an elevated position and it's not meant to do that. So if you take that kind of conceptualization and you put it into the interpersonal context, there's different reactions that are very comparable. So like the fight reaction, interpersonally, we call that, what Chatashia mentioned, moving against. So you'll see some people where conflict really tends to be their guide. A lot of externalized behaviors. They might, have a situation where they felt like they lost power. They felt like they lost control, and they're trying to get that back or compensate it, but it comes across as being so confrontational and so aggressive in their responses. We call that moving against. So if you see someone who's doing that or just always feels on edge, that's probably in that kind of category. The other category was associated to like in the flee response, like the avoidance. We call that moving away. And there are some people who Either they just feel like I can't acknowledge what's going on, so I just avoid it because it's so overwhelming. And we've seen that with our students, like even, you know, students of diverse identities, we just disassociate and just kind of, you know, from their own peers, from their support, just kind of pull away because it's too threatening. Or people who just want to pretend that, you know, 2020 and COVID doesn't exist, you know, because it's too threatening to acknowledge. So if you're seeing those internal behaviors of either isolating, avoiding, I can't read stuff on the news, I just can't, that might just be moving away. So those are kind of associated with a fight or flight response. What we really want to encourage is also another style called moving towards, and that's the one has been associated with the best outcome. So if you've gone through a traumatic event, emotionally, physically, it doesn't really matter what type of trauma, but you have a social support, you have somebody there who's supportive, your outcomes are going to be so much better than someone who doesn't have that support. And so there's a lot of topics that we have about, you know, if something happens on campus, how do we give a gathering place for the students so they can come together? What type of faculty do they have a community and peers, and what type of groups are on our campus? In a counseling center, we're doing a bunch of peer support communities just to get that going away. So fight, flight response, moving against, moving away, moving towards is kind of the best way to put it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. Something that you brought up in terms of the moving towards, I want to explore that a little bit more because, and take it out of the campus context and for our alumni community, talk about some actions that they can take in their different roles that they have. I mentioned this to some of our staff on campus that the first time I felt like as a woman, as a Black woman, that I didn't have to act like everything was okay when I showed up at work was last year. And it was because I had leadership in my organization who created space for us to talk about our trauma, talk about our emotional responses to what we were seeing happening nationally and globally. What are some steps that what are some recommendations, I would say, you can give to our community who's watching of ways they can create opportunities to move towards that emotional response and create that level of support that employees, family, friends may not be experiencing?
I mean, the number one thing I've always asked people, faculty, staff, students, is do you have a sense of community? Like, do you have people that you feel, I mean, you may be surrounded by people, but may feel alone. Like, you know, this difference is like, do you have that foster sense of community? Because that is like one of the biggest buffers in terms of any mental health, but definitely with trauma. So if you have alumni who, especially in their businesses, in the organizations, like, how do you have that sense of community? It could be, you know, like we have employee resource groups. And so maybe you form with certain employees a little type of community. Are you connecting outside of work? Are y'all talking about these issues that are going on? Or do you just go to work and act like nothing's happening, you know, and just focus on your job? Same thing with your neighborhood. You can have a sense of community with your neighbors. You can have a sense of community with other alumni. I mean, alumni inherently is a community. And so how active are they with, you know, coming together? So any way you can foster, promote or join that community, I would say is probably the number one thing that you can do.
Thank you for that. Follow-up question that I have in terms of creating that sense of community, specifically for our community that's watching who strive to be allies in this. Because a lot of times we may feel as alumni of color that it's our burden to create that community for ourselves. So what does allyship look like in creating that community? What steps can our alumni take, or anyone who's watching take, to be that ally in creating community for people of color who are experiencing this type of trauma?
Shatasia, I like your answer in the training, so I'm going to ask you to take this one, what you asked for the faculty to do.
Yes. So I think one of the most important things is to not think that once you become aware that you've done all that you can do. Like there's always more to learn. And then also asking the people who you're trying to be there for, ask them what they need from you. And then, you know, find ways to give that to them. So if they need you to speak up for them in certain situations, or if they need for you to help them build that community so that they're not the ones building it by themselves, you know, you kind of have to reach out to the community that you're trying to help, ask them what they need. and then find ways to give that to them. But most importantly, I think not thinking that your work is done once you are aware. So like for people that have privilege, knowing that you have privilege doesn't make you a great ally. It's what you do with that privilege that matters.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for highlighting that we're literally talking about the first step in this when it comes to awareness. But one of the things that we've said, even within the Alumni Association, is that awareness is only one pillar. We also have to be advocates. We also have to take action and serve as an educational forum as well, in order for us to be holistic in our response to what we're seeing happening nationally and globally. So thank you for highlighting that. I'd like to, again, remind our audience, you can put questions in the chat for Dr. Wood and Chatashia and myself. We want to make sure that we are addressing any questions or comments or concerns that you have regarding this topic. I'd like to turn us, while we're waiting for those, to the individual, because we've talked a lot about us becoming aware of what others are experiencing and how we can be responsive to that. What can we do to ensure that we're aware of our own trauma, and how we can personally seek the support that we need based on that level of personal awareness?
Yeah. So again, I would say, going back to like the fight or flight response, again, you have this baseline and then you're operating up here. That's the whole point. And so emotionally, if you feel that dynamic where, there's just something different, like maybe your anxiety is a lot higher. Maybe you're thinking about something a lot more. Maybe you're just easily frustrated. There's some change in how you relate. There's some change in how you feel. There's some change in how you think. You may not be able to articulate it, but if you know my baseline's here and I'm not there, chances are it's probably some type of emotional trauma. So I would just say, in terms of making it as simplistic as you can, if you know yourself and you just feel off for whatever reason, those are probably signs. I can give you a list, but I don't want people to memorize lists. Yourself. If you feel off or you're getting feedback that you're different, and you're getting feedback that how you relate to other people, the words that you're using, they're different. I think just take all that as something is absolutely there. And so that's kind of the biggest advice I would give, because you're just not at your baseline. And 2020 threw a lot of people off on the baseline. And so how do you recover to go back? And so, yeah, that awareness part is knowing that you're not there. But most of the time, I don't mean this as a criticism, but we do need help to get back. Once we're thrown off, to come back on your own is actually really challenging. And that may not even be the best way to do it. Maybe you do need help, whether it be from a professional, whether it be a community or a minister or a friend, someone to kind of get you grounded again. So,
yeah, that self-awareness is definitely key. You kind of have to know, like, I'm doing this and this is not me normally. And I think that was something that I learned going through the training, was that sometimes when I experience, things that are too much, moving away was my go-to. And so I had to, catch that in myself and realize I actually need to be moving toward. I need to be moving towards my family, my community, because that's where the help lies that's going to get me through this.
Thank you for sharing that. And you both highlighted a couple of things that I want to make sure our audience fully hears, because especially when it comes to seeking support, we know that we want to do more to normalize what that looks like in terms of seeking support, whether it's community support, professional support, and we're going to talk about some of those resources later. But I think that's something that we should definitely ensure that our community hears loud and clear, that a sign of strength is seeking support for being able to move towards that emotional trauma and process it, and be able to move and be able to work past that versus trying to manage it on your own. So I appreciate you all highlighting that. There's another question that we briefly talked about before we went live that I think is a parallel topic. And while we can take steps to understand what we are experiencing emotionally and what that trauma is, I'd like to talk about what I, in my personal experience, call kind of secondhand trauma, or when you see someone else going through something and it triggers an emotional response in yourself. And I think anyone watching this, even if they didn't see the interview that happened on Sunday night, they may have heard a little bit about it. And I'm talking about the Meghan Markle and Prince Harry interview that took place with Oprah Winfrey. And one thing really struck me after watching that, and specifically when we talk about that innate collective that we're a part of course, one of mine is that global collective of Black women. And there was, I think, a visceral response across the globe with Black women as we watched that interview with Meghan Markle as she talked about her experiences, because we've all at some point been there where we've experienced a level of trauma that inflicted upon us by communities that we've been a part of, families, et cetera. So wanted to ask you all, how would you, I just want to talk about what that looks like. And I think Dr. Wood, you talked about it as vicarious trauma.
Mm-hmm.
What does that look like for people, first of all? And then what are some ways that the communities that those who are experiencing vicarious trauma can be responsive to that versus dismissive?
Yeah, I mean, the first part, I mean, the vicarious trauma is very real, but it gets misinterpreted. It gets to like the idea, oh, you're just being political or you're just being opinionated. And sometimes that could be negative, but it's just like, no, like you said, if you have a personal investment, like you heard her speak and it brought back, flashbacks of your memories, then there's nothing political about that. That's not you being opinionated. That's actually you having a reaction that's kind of secondary trauma, exactly as you said. So in terms of the community-wise, if someone really has such a strong reaction, one of the things we're trying to train people is to ask yourself, why is it so strong? Why is it so tense? Is it really just political, or is there something underneath it? A lot of times there's a lot of hurt feelings underneath it, and the reason why. We'll see it on this campus, see it on any campus in the world, is people are so politicized this, and it's not like, well, maybe the intensity is because people have been personally affected by these issues. And so I would just say, take an ownership of that and don't let anybody define you as okay that you're just being opinionated or political. It really shows how prevalent this trauma is, especially for Black women. And so I would really say, even as a community, I would say first, don't let people label you, but just understand that use that as a microphone. Is like you hearing about that brought up your own issues. And so when you do talk about other people, it'd be okay to be open about that and be like, it wasn't just my opinion about her and the royal family, it brought back my own life. So
So in the next part to that question, and this is something that, and we can talk about whether it's vicarious trauma or whether it's trauma that people are individually experiencing, what types of responses should people avoid when they are hearing about someone else's experiences, so that they aren't dismissive and they can be responsive and actually help someone move towards that reconciliation and move towards that healing that they're looking for?
Man, that could be a long list. First of all, I think it's just more than mentality. Like one of the things, especially if you're in a position of power, like if you're a faculty, you're a boss, or you're an employee, first of all, don't just spring it on people. Don't get your employees like, okay, we're going to talk about Black Lives Matter right now. Because you want that predictability, because that in itself could be traumatized. Someone has to go to work and be expected to talk about something very divisive. So I wouldn't just, even if you have great intentions, don't just throw it out there like that, because that could cause a lot of harm. But I guess the answer to your question, and Chatashia, you can ask me, help me, is the temptation is to make it political, or to make it about like, well, disagreement, well, you have your thought, well, I disagree with that, or to make it personal, like, well, you're so angry, why are you angry, at me? You want to avoid, again, if you realize that this person is trauma and you have this mentality that this is coming from a trauma, think about it. If someone is trauma, you're not going to try to throw opinions at them. You're not going to try to throw judgments at them. You're not going to try to throw criticism at it. Once it connects into this person's really struggling, I think that in itself will kind of filter a lot of words and a lot of attitudes and a lot of things that you do. So that's what I would say. But Chatashia, I'm curious from a student position, what responses you wouldn't want to hear.
Yeah, I think gaslighting is like one of the biggest like avoid, especially when it comes to things that you may not be able to relate to. A lot of times people want to assume that you're politicizing something or you're over exaggerating. And I think a lot of times people just want someone to listen and understand. We don't necessarily have to agree on this topic, but you cannot deny what someone is feeling, what someone is going through. And so I think the biggest things that people don't want is to be gaslighted into believing that they're crazy or they're just making this up. They really want someone to listen and understand what it is that they're going through and not be made to look like, this is not a big deal or something like that.
Thank you. You both brought up that term of gaslighting. So I want to make sure that we define what that is for our audience so that we can recognize in ourselves if we're actually moving towards that response, and so that others can recognize if it's actually something that they're experiencing at the hands of someone else. So can you provide that definition for us and maybe some examples of what that sounds like?
So it's basically a form of manipulation, almost making someone think that what happened to them isn't true, or if it did happen, then it wasn't. So that's usually one of the main responses that people give when they're gaslighting is that didn't happen, or if it did, it wasn't that big of a deal.
Thank you for that. Thank you. So we've talked a lot about what responses should look like. We talked about what they shouldn't look like, how we can become more aware if we are experiencing emotional or cultural based trauma. So I'd like to make that a little bit more tangible for our audience, if possible. What are some of the triggers? We talked more about the kind of global pieces of how we might experience cultural trauma. So what are some other triggers of culturally based trauma that we should be aware of, whether large or small?
Like individual triggers, I mean, so I guess some of the signs, like rumination is one of them. So if you have something that's in your mind and you just can't get it out and you're thinking about it, and thinking about it over and over and over again, we'll see a lot of that with people with news. They just get almost obsessed with watching news and reading about it and over and over and over and over again, to the point where it's just not healthy. It's not about education. You're doing it because you have anxiety and you're trying to find something to kind of reduce that. So, I mean, that mentally would just be, I mean, that's a big one. Another trigger is the fact if you have triggers, I know it sounds weird, but sometimes if you're walking around, someone says something and you immediately have a strong reaction to it, and you immediately have an argument like with employees or spouses or anything. I mean, the fact that you have triggers is something that, okay, that is probably related to trauma, because you have something that hasn't been processed, hasn't been dealt with. And as soon as someone says something about it, there you go. So I think that is another one. But also, again, just emotionally, if you start feeling like draining energy, again, trauma responses are designed, the adrenaline boost, to help us out. But if you're lingering there and there's no action taken, pretty soon you're going to get drained. You're going to get sick, you're going to get fatigued. So if you're seeing some of those signs too, those are also signs that something just isn't right.
Thank you. So you mentioned, you clarified with that question of what the individual, if we talking about individual triggers, what are some of the more, I would say, societal ones that we should be aware of? Let's list those out as well, because especially in companies and organizations, sometimes they are perpetuators of these. So some of those more societal that we need to hear.
Well, I mean, one of the big ones would be how divisive things are. Like one of the, interpersonal reactions moving against. So conflict, if you're seeing this divisiveness where people are just automatically taking sides, they're not going to the middle, this is a polarization. I feel like I'm talking about America in 2020, but if really that is one thing we will look at, to be like, maybe all the polarization is coming from trauma. It's coming from people who felt like they didn't have control, didn't have power, and wanted to go back to their secure base, what they know. And so if you think about society, what's going on in America, most people would agree, no matter what side you're on, this has been probably one of the most divisive phases in our history. So what's underneath that? What's fueling that? My guess is not just one personality. it's a trauma. If a lot of people who are traumatized, they are going to, just because of self-preservation, take a stand, and combat other people, what we call moving against. So when you start seeing that, like, especially if you're an authority and because you're the ones probably going to get it. So if you're an employer and your employees are just all of a sudden conflict against you, if they're really strong, I mean, it's challenging to be like, hey, what's underneath that? Like, you want, especially if you have the privilege to do something, but it's challenging to be like, you know what, instead of just being authoritative, I'm just going to listen and trying to like go deeper. But that would really be the best response, because if you match their level, then you just perpetuate the challenge. So if you're seeing that moving against a response, that polarization, that conflict, that the gossip, the rumors, people trying to tear you down, those things is a good reaction that your organization is probably, there's a lot of people, trauma in that organization. And the other thing is people who are disengaging, people who are disconnecting, people who aren't kind of as productive they used to be, aren't as efficient, that could be moving away. So, yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. I think it's really important for us to see, again, be really, really tangible in understanding how we can recognize when trauma is present, and so that we can move from awareness towards action. I'm curious, what are some of the, you talked about really looking at the behaviors of others to understand if trauma is present. What are some of those, I would say, negative actions that contribute to trauma? So let me just put it out there. We hear a lot about microaggressions. We hear a lot about other actions that people engage in that contribute to the trauma that other people experience. So let's talk about that for a little bit. Can we define what microaggressions are, and even other types of actions that people engage in that actually are contributors to people's culturally based trauma?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different ways to go. I mean, microaggressions, I mean, some people think about, it's the overt, oppression, it's the overt, racism, that is actually the most harmful. But there's a lot of research saying those subtle ones actually take more of an emotional toll, because if something is overt, it's obvious, okay, you're wrong, but the subtle ones can make people second guess themselves, those subtle comments about gender, about race, or kind of beliefs can make people say, what's my place here, and take people not comfortable. So when people have those microaggressions, one, it can make people second guess themselves, but it also says, okay, what is the attitude of the person who's given the microaggression, because they might say, well, I'm not overt, so everything I'm saying now is okay, even though it's subtle, but it's not. It's like perpetuating pain and emotional. So, I mean, it's like a double whammy on that part, So when some people definitely have microaggressions, and a lot of times, especially in, when we're talking about trauma, if you're privileged enough where you didn't have certain types of trauma that other people have, and you start minimizing that, or you start getting the message like, hey, just get over it, then you're traumatizing, because then you're giving the message of, okay, here I am being traumatized, but then I got my boss telling me get over it. And so now I'm not doing well, because of what happened in society that I didn't ask for. So it goes in this cycle, so you really want to be aware. We have one of our psychiatrists in the medical school who does a training. He always says that trauma begets trauma begets trauma. He says that over and over again. He said, if you have trauma and you don't process it, or you're not even aware of it, even if you don't have trauma, then you're very likely to traumatize someone else. So, a case in point, we always use like a faculty member. If you have a faculty member who's not aware of their own trauma, let's say they have stuff in their emotional life that's going on, they're very likely to say something that could affect a student. Or on the flip side of it, you have a faculty member who somehow, so privileged, had no trauma, which doesn't exist, but let's say there was one, and just completely disregard, minimize it, wasn't even aware, then it's very likely they're going to say something that might be traumatizing to someone else. So trauma begets trauma begets trauma, for sure.
Thank you for pointing that out, because a lot of times we don't realize how this can actually be building blocks, right?
Oh,
yeah. People who are experiencing one thing, they actually contribute to someone else's experience as well. Chatashia, I'm curious. I know we defined microaggressions and how that actually can be more damaging than some of the overt experiences that people typically default to when we think about this. In your experience, even with the students on campus, what are some specific examples of what those more subtle aggressions look like for students of color, faculty and staff of color, alumni of color, so we can be really clear on what this sounds like and feels like to our community?
Yeah, I think talking to especially students of color, they experience so many different microaggressions in and outside of the classroom. So a lot of times, if they're a Black student at TCU, they might get people might assume that they're here on like an athletic scholarship. And so they would assume, that might not seem like a bad thing on the surface, like, oh, I just thought you were here as a student athlete. But then when you kind of dig deeper, you will find that unconscious bias of that you believe that this person didn't make it into TCU on their own merit, or that they would not meet the qualifications to come here unless, they were an athlete. And a lot of times, that does affect them, and it makes them question whether this is somewhere that they actually belong. And a lot of times they also experience that in the classroom with faculty members not believing that they are kind of knowledgeable on certain topics, or not thinking that they are smart enough to handle certain topics. That can be traumatizing, coming here, trying to get your education, and be microaggressed so often just because of the way you look.
Well, I appreciate you bringing up those examples, and I'm very thankful that you brought up the idea of the unconscious bias piece, because a lot of times I want to make sure that we point this out, that we can be so unaware of what our own biases are and how they're contributing to someone else's experience or an emotional response. So a lot of times we're engaging in behaviors and actually engaging in responses that we aren't aware are problematic. And so I'm very grateful that you have brought that piece up, because more often than not, that's what seems to happen, is that it's the lack of awareness, which goes back to the incredible training that you all are doing on campus, so that the level of awareness increases across the university, for our faculty, staff, and now for our broader alumni community as well. So I'd like to bring us full circle before we wrap up. You mentioned earlier, Dr. Wood, that you started with the awareness training, and now you're moving into experiential. Can you talk to us? I think something really beautiful has happened because of the awareness training and what the request was of our faculty and staff. So can you give us an update on why this experiential training is actually happening and what that's going to look like for our community?
I mean, it was the biggest feedback we got when we did the awareness trainings, that people actually wanted to practice. They actually wanted to say, how can I learn how to give this trauma-informed reaction to the students right in front of me? And we're notorious. I mean, there's always been faculty that have always been our advocates, and every time we train, it's the same faculty. But there's some from other faculty who say, they just acknowledge, like, hey, I don't know anything about this. And so, yeah, we do have a lofty goal. My goal is to get every faculty member to go through that training. And I don't know if that's something the alumni can help us with, because, I mean, overall, most of the people, I mean, the faculty, they're supportive. Absolutely, I'm going to say that. But I would like all of them to have it. And so that's our goal. And so that's our hope. And so what we ideal is, I mean, there's different ways. I mean, we have, applied to get some for an internal grant. If we get that, we can have a combination of like a video where we do role plays where the faculty will actually have to respond and role play and practice with the therapist, one of our facilitators, about how to give trauma-informed responses. So there's different ways to do it. We're actually in the middle of actually developing it right now. But the goal would be, by the summer, we'll have it done. In the fall, we can start doing it. And we don't do it until every faculty and staff does it. That's our hope. So.
Fantastic. And with that next step happening, Chatashia, what do you see as being the positive impact on our students as faculty and staff become more aware of what culturally based trauma is, how to have culturally informed responses, and as we begin to really infuse that into the culture of our university?
I think one of the biggest things will be that students will feel safe. They will feel safe in their classroom. They will feel safe in the different buildings that they go into to see different staff members. I think because we talked about it in one of the awareness trainings that students were afraid to have in-person classes for fear of, certain divisive topics being brought up, not wanting to be in person in class because you might be afraid that Black Lives Matter might be brought up. And so I think knowing every faculty and staff member has gone through this training and has practiced giving trauma-informed responses will make students feel a lot safer in their classrooms and just on campus in general because they know that they have the support of people who have gone through this training and have learned more to be able to provide that support for students.
Fantastic. And I know that that is just at the core of what we're striving towards as a university, is to ensure that that inclusive and safe space is sustained at the university level. And I believe that with us discussing this with our broader alumni community, that we'll actually be able to take it just from the campus and university level and actually have some impact across other environments as well, based on the incredible information that you all have shared. You shared with us today. I'd like to once again, before we share the resources, just make sure our audience knows that if there are any pressing questions that you all have before the end of our time today, that you make sure you put those in the chat and let us know, because I want to make sure that we get as much from our experts today as possible, even though I know we'll be able to do some follow-up on this topic as well. But while we're waiting to see if there are any additional questions, I'd like to move towards some resources that we can provide for our community. It's one thing for us to talk about this topic and shed light on how critical it is, but we need to look at what are the steps that people can individually take as well as collectively take to get the support that they need. So I know I have some specific resources that I want to share, but I'd like to hear from you all what resources we can point our audience to.
I saw some scroll down at the bottom of these while we were talking. Those are some of the, especially if you're in distress. I mean, the crisis text line and even the suicide prevention lifeline is actually good resources. But I also saw you posted the American Psychological Association has a lot of things about racial inequity and trauma. There's a Trauma Stress Institute, even SAMHSA, which is Department of Health and Human Services, has, they are there. Y'all guys are really good. These are resources, and Chatashia, and helps give the warning to our faculty, learn more about them, if it's for you too, but you can also go and just kind of learn. There is more than just the ones up here. You can actually take some time, it's important to, and read about them. These are just the organizations that are just kind of known as leaders in mental health that you can go and just read their sections on trauma. So definitely those.
Thank you so much. And if we could, we never know, we may have some students who are watching as well. So what are the resources on campus that our students can tap into to get the support they need as well?
I mean, obviously, I'm going to say the counseling center for that. And I would encourage students to come to us. I mean, we're hearing people, so we saw an increase in 24. But I always tell people, the status, we saw 48% more students than we did, last year than we did before, which is huge. But it also means we managed 48%. We've gotten a lot of new programs that we didn't have a couple years ago. A lot of support from the institution. So some people say, well, don't go to counseling because it might be just they're too busy and anything. And it's no, I mean, we have elevated kind of our game to kind of match what's going on. So please contact the counseling center. There are students, like Dr. Wood is on there. You can email me at all, because some students are just really, really scared about going to counseling. They want one person to be a contact person. And so if that's you, feel free to email me. I'll definitely get you connected for sure.
Fantastic. And I want to underscore some of the resources that Dr. Wood mentioned. You saw the websites that we posted. We are going to make the list of resources available in our comment section as well, so you can have direct access to that. There are a few that I just want to ensure that we highlight. I want to make sure that if you are currently experiencing any distress, to please contact the National Crisis Text Line or the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at the numbers that are scrolling below. Those numbers are also available in the comment section as well, for your benefit. Specifically for our alumni, we are highlighting our community of therapists that we have within our Alumni Association on hornfrogsconnect.com. I have specific commitments from therapists of color who are also alumni of the university who have created profiles on hornfrogsconnect.com so that you can connect directly with them. We know the importance of representation in the therapist community, and we want to make sure that we highlight those who are a part of our Horn Frog family as well. So please visit Horn Frogs Connect. You'll see those profiles as we highlight them. And last but not least, I want to just thank Dr. Eric Wood and Chatashia Brown for joining us today for this critical topic. Again, as I mentioned before, we had some really critical conversations last year on what we could do as an alumni association to ensure that we were discussing the topics that are really that we need to discuss, and even those that might at first glance bring about a perception of discomfort, but ones that we need to still tackle. And so I appreciate you all joining us today for our first topic. I mentioned at the start of this episode that this is a series, and we will be doing this quarterly, the Purple Table Talk, where we address topics that our alumni deem as important. So I would encourage you to let us know, what do you want to hear about? What do you want to discuss? And how can we help you become more aware of these topics, how you become better at taking action and becoming advocates in this area, and topics under the realm of diversity, equity, and inclusion. You also saw that if you are an alumni therapist, we'd love for you to add your profile so that we can ensure we are providing the resources and support that our alumni community needs for this topic and many others. I want to thank everyone for joining us today and being a part of this conversation. As always, our goal is to ensure that we're providing that level of support that our alumni and broader TCU community needs, regardless of topic. So again, thank you all for this incredible discussion and the robust resources that you provided for us. And we will see you all during our next table talk, which will air in May. So thanks everyone, and have a wonderful afternoon and a great week. Take care.